We do have some time for questions before the reception, and also, as before, if you would please raise your hands, but also use the microphones so that our video can capture the sound effectively. And let's open the floor for questions.
Thank you so much for 3 extraordinary days, 3 extraordinary lectures. Just a quick question about what happens to this division, this imaginative division between the work-free life of prayer and the life of drudgery by the 5th or 6th century, when prayer itself becomes a form of drudgery in the Opus Dei, and so when liturgy and the cycle of monastic prayer becomes a kind of labor, of work in itself. So is that an end point of this, one of the end points? So where does that language come from?
I think it is an end point, provided you don't make it, as it were, a permanent end point. I think these 2 models really do continue to be in conflict in all sorts of ways, right through Byzantium, right through Western Christendom. I think that even in Egypt, it's very plain that the bigger the monasteries, the greater the endowments, the more emphasis on prayer. The monastery itself becomes an increasingly sacral place. When Shenute of Atripe speaks of the great white monastery, he speaks of it, and this is interesting, he doesn't say it himself, he says, those who come to us as pilgrims call us the heavenly Jerusalem. So I think it's an indication of the lay pressure to have what I think any student of either the Appellations or the early Middle Ages calls powerhouses of prayer. Powerhouses of prayer are very rarely needed, and I think that is one way the story goes. There's also a story that bold, bad bishops, of course, hem in the monks because they don't like monks wandering round and they don't like free spirits. And by the time they actually legislate to control monks, everyone sits back and says, I told you so. I'm not so sure about that story. Bishops were very hassled people. They probably didn't have time to even worry about controlling monks. But there is certainly a feeling about this. The economy may play a role. This is the boom period of northern Syria, archaeologically. It's also the boom period of a monetarized economy. And I think that one must remember the wonderful thing about Manichaean elect and wandering monks of Syria, they don't cost you very much. They really cost you no more than board and breakfast. And I think there is definitely a slowing down of that angelic wandering life as the economy recedes, just as there's an immediate start-up once the Western economy begins to open up again. I think the Cathars would have easily recognized the holy men of Syria as their ancestors. And it isn't surprising that this does appear at a time when there is much more cash around, particularly in the southern than France. So I think as long as we don't regard the victory of the big monastery as a victory simply of the organized church over free spirits, I think that's a perfectly good way to tell the story. You're absolutely right. And of course, with any historical hypothesis, what the great French scholar Henri-Irénée Marot would always insist on was the law of the epilogue. No historical period or phenomenon is intelligible until you tell the reader what comes after.
Hi, thank you. I was interested in your depiction of the Egyptians as the kind of people who value work, since the Greeks and Romans kind of thought of Egypt as a place where you didn't have to work, you just throw the seed out and crops grow miraculously from the ground. So it seems kind of ironic that the Egyptians are responsible for promoting work's reputation throughout the ancient world. And I was wondering if you had thought any about that.
Yes, I think that's a very, very good that's a wonderful question. I think it's a very good example of how Egyptians felt about themselves is very different from how people wish to feel about Egypt. Egypt was always a sort of Shangri-La. An exact analogy is, of course, China, as seen by Roman authors. China, the Roman authors really believed that silk just grew on trees. And if you think of the amount of labor that the Han government put into forcing peasants to give them silk, it's just an absurd utopian view. I think one thing about Egypt is the more you study it, the more diverse a country it becomes. I think this might answer the first question. There are some areas, such as Middle Egypt, which are, how to put it, they aren't as lush, and they're actually agricultural. A sort of minor agricultural revolution is actually happening there, bringing land into, but extremely marginal land, into play, and this is where the great Pachomian monasteries happen to be. So I would urge people to realize that Egypt isn't just a single big thing. Egypt's enormously long. It's almost 1,000 miles from the Mediterranean to the southern borders of Egypt. Good, thank you very much.
Yes, you said that the Desert Fathers, or the angelic monks in Syria, had this sharper, clearer view of the ills of society because of their lifestyle. I just wanted to ask, to what extent did they confront the ills that they saw, or did they just by their lifestyle confront that? Because I think of the story, that's a fictitious tale, but the story of Anatole France with Thais, and the monk, the Desert Father, comes in and tries to whisk away the courtesan from Alexandria. I was wondering if that's historical, or are there any other ways that they really confronted it?
I didn't catch the sort of Anatole France bit.
Yeah, one of in the tale, a Desert Father comes into Alexandria to try to rescue society from this illustrious courtesan. He takes her out.
Yeah, that's great. Yes, I think that tells you much more about the lovely imagination of 19th century Frenchmen. We love them for it, but the monks weren't awfully like that. I think, no, it's a genuine issue, and I think there is a real sense of engagement in the world. It's one of the great temptations to a monk. Evagrius of Pontus, with this extraordinary, almost psychoanalytic case book of the sort of temptations to which a monk can be subject, very much includes, as it were, what we would call social the activism, returning to the city, returning to preach. Hence the boundary between desert and the secular world was actually held rather tightly in Egypt, maybe out of fear, because that would be what they would do. In these matters, we shouldn't underestimate how very rapidly Both in Egypt and Syria, monks emerge as representatives of oppressed groups. If you want to break an emperor's heart, you send a monk. So there is a real social activism of a very real sort. Oddly enough, I think more in Syria, because if you're an angel, you're not polluted by the world to such an extent. So one of the interesting things is the number of Syrian monks active right in Constantinople, acting as almost like Franciscan father confessors, acting as giving blessing to emperors, as intervening, as helping petitions. So these were not people who put the world behind them, partly because the more we study the topography of Egyptian monasticism, the closer to the settled land they are seen to actually be. Even Antony finally made his way to deep desert at the edge of the Red Sea, but leaving his village in the Fayoum, he was for at least 30 years very close to the land, to the normal land.
I was interested in your mention of the prophecy of Neferti and the role that Egyptian apocalypticism plays in the development of the ideas that you're speaking to. And one thing I was thinking of was that another very important aspect of Egyptian apocalypticism is the fear that their sacred animals are going to be slaughtered. And I wonder if that might connect to the same point you were trying to make, namely that their sort of primal fear was of loss of nourishment, and that one of the things that they're afraid of is that things will get so bad that they will slaughter their animals, presumably, and eat them. And that so that part of this sort of dystopia that they envision involves the slaughter of animals. And then, of course, you can see this play out in different sort of other ways in texts from the ancient world that seem to reflect the same concern. For very sort of selfish classicist reasons, I think of Cambyses in Egypt and his killing of the Apis bull. But then, of course, there's also the story in that of his occupation of Egypt, of the cannibalism that the invaders turn upon themselves. So again, it would sort of look back to this same engine or driver of fear of the loss of nourishment.
Oh yes, thank you very, very much. I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, this is a world where perhaps the ultimate cannibalism is to destroy your livestock. What you're saying is this is a very apocalyptic place. Looks very solid, but people are constantly worried about what we would call the world turned upside down. And right up to the great Asclepius prophecies, which Christians immediately took to mean the end of paganism, but Egyptians were constantly expecting the end. They were rather like Romans that way. An enormously self-confident society that spent its whole time glooming about its own decline and fall.